18 hours felt like 18 years. Cathari spent every minute of them moving between refugee zones, helping to organize what little remained of her people's civilization. The Velinari had gathered in clusters across the planet, hiding in underground transit systems, in the basements of collapsed buildings, in natural cave networks that the swarm had not yet reached. They were afraid. They were hungry. Many of them were injured. And the Draketh were getting closer with every passing hour. In the underground shelter beneath the ruins of the city of Velinur, a Velinari teacher named Orethi was trying to keep 43 children calm. She had been running a school for young ones when the swarm arrived. She had gathered every child she could find and led them underground, and she had not slept since. Her 4 arms moved constantly, soothing a crying child here, adjusting a blanket there, checking a wound on a little one who had been cut by falling debris. "Are we going to die?" asked a small boy named TL. He was 6 years old, and his bioluminescence had gone completely dark, which in a Velinari child meant that the body was beginning to shut down from stress. Orethi pulled him close. "No," she said firmly. "Someone is coming to help us." "Who?" "Humans." TL blinked. "What are humans?" Orethi realized she did not really know. Then the sky split open. The first sign was a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground. People in the shelters felt it in their bones. Those who were above ground saw it directly. 8 shapes, tearing out of fold space like knives cutting through fabric. The ships were unlike anything the Velinari had ever seen. They were not elegant or graceful. They were angular, heavy, and covered in armor plating and weapon systems. They looked like they had been designed by people who expected to be shot at, and had decided to make that everyone else's problem. The lead vessel was enormous. The UES Coronado was a marine assault carrier, and it moved through the space above Salur with the confidence of a predator entering a territory it had already decided was its own. Behind it came 3 destroyers, their hulls scarred from previous engagements. 2 frigates held the flanks. A pair of fast attack corvettes scouted ahead, already scanning the surface and transmitting targeting data back to the fleet. On the bridge of the Coronado, Colonel Patrick Dunn stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with gray at his temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from something hard and weathered. He had been a Marine for 30 years. He had fought in the border wars, in the colony insurrections, in the silent engagements along the contested zones that never made the news. But he had never seen anything like the tactical display in front of him. The planet below was dying. Thermal imaging showed the Draketh swarm covering entire landmasses, a moving blanket of heat signatures so dense that the computer could not count individual creatures. The estimated number was somewhere above 2 billion on the surface, with more pouring through fold space tears every hour. Scattered among this ocean of predators were the surviving pockets of Velinari civilians, bright spots of warmth surrounded by darkness. "Colonel," said Lieutenant Amy Soto, his operations officer. She was young, sharp, and had the kind of voice that stayed calm when everything around it was falling apart. "First wave is prepped for drop. 400 Marines and 60 pods, targeting the 6 largest refugee concentrations. Second wave follows in 40 minutes. Make the first wave 30 minutes, Dunn said. And get Captain Vega on the ground with them. I want a command element on the surface as soon as boots hit dirt." "Yes, sir." Dunn looked at the display one more time. 4,000 Marines against 2 billion swarm creatures. The math was not good. He had known that before they left. Every Marine on this ship had known it. They had come anyway. 3 decks below in the drop pod bay, the air was thick with the sound of preparation. Hundreds of Marines moved through the bay in organized chaos, checking weapons, sealing armor, running final diagnostics on their pods. The pods themselves were simple things, designed for one purpose: to deliver a Marine from orbit to the surface as fast as possible, while keeping them alive in the process. They were not comfortable, but they worked. Sergeant First Class Danny Harlow stood beside his pod and watched his squad get ready. He had been a Marine for 12 years, and these were his people. He knew each of them, the way you know someone when you have trusted them with your life. Corporal Lucia Reyes was checking her rifle for the 4th time, her dark eyes focused and her movements precise. She was from a farming family, and she treated her weapon the way her parents treated their tools, with respect and constant attention. Private First Class Cody Marsh was the youngest in the squad, just 22, and he was humming under his breath the way he always did before a drop. It drove everyone crazy, but nobody told him to stop, because they all knew it was how he kept his fear under control. Lance Corporal Priya Nolan was taping extra ammunition magazines to her vest, with the careful precision of someone who had learned from hard experience that you always needed more rounds than you thought. Harlow called them in. Listen up. What we're dropping into is not a standard engagement. The enemy is a swarm species. No intelligence, no command structure, no morale to break. They eat organic matter and they reproduce. That is all they do. The locals are non-combatants. No weapons, no military, no concept of self-defense. Everything between the swarm and 600 million civilians is going to be us. Rules of engagement? Asked Reyes. If it has chitin and it is moving toward a civilian, you put it down. Conserve ammunition where you can. The swarm does not feel pain and does not retreat, so do not waste rounds trying to scare them. Every shot counts. How many hostiles on the surface? Asked Marsh, who had stopped humming. Current estimate is above 2 billion. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. So pacing is important, Harlow said. A few of them laughed. It was the kind of laugh that existed in a space between courage and madness. The kind of laugh that humans have been using before impossible fights since the beginning of their history. It did not make the fear go away, but it made the fear smaller, and that was enough. The launch signal came. The pods dropped in staggered waves, 60 at a time, firing from the belly of the Coronado like seeds falling from some great metal tree. From the surface, the Velinari saw them as streaks of light cutting through the gray sky. Hundreds of bright lines burning through the smoke and ash, falling toward the ground with terrifying speed. In the underground shelter, Orethi felt the ground shake. She held TL tighter and looked up at the ceiling as dust fell from the cracks. Then the sounds changed. The first pod hit the ground at the edge of Velinor with a boom that rattled windows 3 kilometers away. The hatch blew open before the dust settled, and Danny Harlow stepped out into a world that smelled like burning and death. His boots hit alien soil. His visor filtered the worst of the smoke. Through the haze, he could see the outline of the ruined city, and beyond it, the dark tide of the swarm moving through the broken streets. Behind him, more pods hit the ground. Marines poured out, forming up with practiced speed, rifles raised, covering each other as they spread into a defensive perimeter. In less than 3 minutes, 40 Marines had established a line between the refugee zone and the advancing swarm. The creatures changed direction, thousands of them turning as one, drawn by the heat and movement of new prey. They came fast, skittering over rubble and through gaps in the walls, their eyeless heads pointed straight at the Marine line. Harlow raised his hand. 40 Marines sighted down their weapons. Hold, Harlow said. The swarm closed to 300 meters. 200. 100. Fire. The night lit up. The sound of concentrated gunfire filled the streets of Velinor. A roar so loud that it reached the underground shelters where the Velinari were hiding. The children covered their ears. Orethi held Teal and closed her eyes. Above them, on the surface, the Marines were fighting, and for the first time in 11 days, the Dracath swarm was not advancing. It was being stopped. TL looked up at Arethi with wide, dark eyes. "Is that them?" he whispered. "Is that the humans?" Arethi listened to the continuous thunder above their heads. It did not stop. It did not slow down. It kept going, steady and relentless, like the heartbeat of something that refused to die. "Yes," she said, "that is the humans." And somewhere above them, standing in smoke and fire, Danny Harlow and his Marines held the line. The first day was chaos. The second day was worse. By the third day, it had become something else entirely. A grinding, endless test of endurance that turned hours into lifetimes. The Marines held 6 defensive perimeters around the largest refugee concentrations on the planet. Each perimeter was a circle of fire and noise that the Draketh threw themselves against in wave after wave after wave. The swarm did not sleep. It did not eat, at least not in the way that required it to pause. It simply kept coming, an ocean of chitin and claws that broke against the Marine lines and reformed and came again. Colonel Dunn ran the operation from a forward command post on the surface. He had set up inside a Velinari building that had once been a library, surrounded by shelves of crystal data tablets that glowed with stored knowledge. Holographic maps floated above tables designed for beings with 4 arms. Lieutenant Soto stood beside him, feeding him information in a steady stream that never stopped. "Sector 3 has repelled 14 assaults in the last 8 hours, Soto reported. "Ammunition is at 60% across all sectors. Casualty count is 47 wounded, 11 critical, 4 dead." Dunn processed this without expression. 4 dead in 3 days against 2 billion was remarkable. It was also 4 people who would never go home, and he felt every one of them like a weight on his chest. "What about Sector 7? Harlow's position?" Soto pulled up the data. "Sergeant Harlow's platoon has been in continuous contact with the enemy for 19 hours straight. They are holding, but his Marines are exhausted. Ammunition is at 40%. He has requested resupply, but has declined rotation." "Why declined?" "There is a medical shelter 200 meters behind his line. Over 3,000 Velinari civilians, including several hundred children. Harlow says if his platoon rotates out, and the replacement takes even 10 minutes to get set, the swarm could breach. He will not risk it." Dunn closed his eyes for a moment. Danny Harlow had been under his command for 6 years. He knew the man well enough to know that this was not stubbornness or pride. It was a calculation. Harlow had looked at the civilians behind him, looked at the swarm in front of him, and decided that his own exhaustion was an acceptable cost. That was the kind of decision that Marines made every day on Solor, and it was the kind of decision that would haunt them for years afterward. "Get him resupply," Dunn said. "Double the ammunition and send stimulants, medical grade, and tell him I am sending a reserve squad to reinforce, not replace. He can keep his line." On the ground, the reality of the fighting was something that no briefing could have prepared anyone for. The Draketh were not soldiers. They were not even really enemies in the way that a thinking being could be an enemy. They were a biological process, a swarm driven by instinct and chemical signals from a hive mind that no one had yet located. Each individual creature was about the size of a large dog, covered in black chitin, with 6 legs ending in sharp points, and a mouth that could bite through light armor. They did not feel pain. They did not fear death. They simply moved forward, and when one fell, the ones behind it climbed over the body and kept coming. The Marines adapted the way humans always adapted, fast, messy, and with a creativity that bordered on madness. Corporal Lucia Reyes made the first breakthrough on the second day. She noticed that when certain frequencies played through the squad's communication equipment, the Draketh nearest to the speakers became disoriented, moving in circles instead of forward. She reported this to Lieutenant Soto, who passed it to the engineers aboard the Coronado. Within 6 hours, portable sonic emitters were being dropped to every sector. They did not stop the swarm, but they slowed it, creating pockets of confusion that gave the Marines precious seconds to reload and reposition. Private Marsh made the second discovery almost by accident. During a lull in the fighting, he sat down on a patch of exposed mineral soil and noticed that the Draketh were avoiding it. He scraped up a sample and sent it to the ship for analysis. By the next morning, chemical barriers made from a compound found in Salur's native rock were being laid around every refugee zone. The swarm would not cross them willingly, buying time and saving lives. But it was not just the fighting that defined those days. It was what happened in between. Captain Nora Vega had established herself at the largest refugee zone in Valinor, coordinating between the Marine ground forces and the Velinari civilian leadership. She slept 2 hours a night, ate when someone put food in front of her, and moved through the camp with a focus that never wavered. Ambassador Cathari followed her, translating between the species and trying to understand these strange beings who had crossed the stars to fight for people they did not know. On the second night, Cathari found Vega in the field hospital. A Velinari elder had fallen during an evacuation and broken 2 of his forearms. Velinari bones were different from human bones, more like flexible crystal than rigid calcium. The medics had no idea how to set them. Vega was kneeling beside the elder, studying the break, comparing it to a Velinari anatomy scan she had pulled up on a datapad. "I think if we immobilize here and here," Vega said to the medic, a young man named Pete Galloway, who looked like he had not slept in 2 days. "The crystal matrix should realign on its own. We just need to keep it still." "You're guessing," Galloway said. "Educated guessing," Vega replied. "Best we've got." They splinted the arms. The elder looked up at Vega with large silver eyes and said something in Velinari that Cathari translated as, "Your hands are warm." Vega smiled, the first smile Cathari had seen from her. "Tell him he's going to be okay." Cathari translated, and then she asked the question that had been building inside her for 3 days. "Captain Vega, why?" Vega looked up. "Why what? Why are you here? Your species barely knows us. The Torvon have been our allies for 1,000 years, and they sent us a letter. The hegemony shares a border with us, and they offered prayers. You came from across the galaxy with 4,000 soldiers to fight an enemy you had never seen before. Why?" Vega was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the Velinari elder, then around the field hospital, where human medics were treating Velinari patients with careful, uncertain hands, figuring out alien biology as they went. "Because you asked," Vega said, "and because we could. That's it. That's the whole reason." Cathari stared at her. She searched for a word in the Velinari language that could contain this concept, the idea of sacrificing yourself for a stranger, not because of obligation or strategy or reward, but simply because the stranger was suffering and you had the ability to help. The closest was a term from ancient Velinari poetry that described a kind of love so selfless that it was considered impossible, a myth. "My people have a word," Cathari said slowly. "Veluarshan. It means a love that gives everything and asks for nothing. We always believed it was just a story, something from old poems that could not exist in the real world." Veda's expression softened. "Well," she said, "maybe we're not the best at poetry, but we're pretty good at showing up." A sound like thunder rolled through the camp. Another wave of Drakeths was hitting the perimeter. Vega's hand went to her sidearm immediately, her body shifting from gentle to ready in less than a second. But the line held. The Marines held. They always held. In Sector 7, Danny Harlow was on hour 23 of continuous combat. His hands were cramped around his rifle. His eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. Behind him, Priya Noland had taken a hit to her left side from a Draketh claw that had gotten through a gap in the barricade. She had pressed a field bandage against the wound with one hand and kept firing with the other. Cody Marsh had burned through his last magazine and switched to his sidearm without a word, dropping Draketh at close range with a calm that would have been terrifying in any other context. Through the broken wall behind the Marine line, Harlow could see the medical shelter. He could see Velinari medics moving among the wounded. He could see children, small and glowing faintly, watching the Marines with eyes that held something between terror and wonder. Harlow reloaded. He raised his rifle. He kept firing. 24 hours, 25, 26. On the fourth day, the swarm changed. Until that point, the Draketh had attacked in broad waves, spreading across the defensive perimeters like water trying to find a crack. It was relentless, but it was predictable. The Marines had learned the patterns, built their tactics around them, and held their ground. Then the waves stopped, and something worse began. Lieutenant Soda was the first to notice it on the tactical display. She watched the heat signatures on the map shift, thousands of individual creatures pulling back from the perimeter lines and merging into massive columns. Huge concentrations of swarm, moving with a coordination that they had not shown before. "Colonel," she said, and the tone of her voice made Dunn turn immediately. "The swarm is reorganizing. They are concentrating forces into single-point columns. I am seeing 5 major formations, each estimated at over 10 million creatures, converging on specific sectors." Dunn looked at the display. His stomach dropped. They are learning. The hive mind, wherever it was, had spent 4 days testing the Marine defenses. It had found the pattern, and now it was doing what any intelligence system would do with that information. It was sending everything it had at the weakest points. The first column hit Sector 4 at dawn. 10 million Draketh, moving as a single mass, struck the defensive line like a battering ram made of living bodies. The Marines fought with everything they had. The sonic emitters screamed at full power. The chemical barriers burned the front ranks of the swarm. The creatures in front died, and the ones behind climbed over them, and the ones behind those climbed higher still, building ramps of their own dead until they were pouring over the barricades. Second platoon held for 37 minutes before the line broke. The swarm flooded through the gap and into the refugee zone behind it. 3,000 Velinari civilians were inside, including a group of children sheltered in a basement that had once been a storage facility. What happened next would be studied and discussed across the galaxy for generations. Orethi, the teacher who had kept 43 children alive in underground shelters since the first day, was in that basement. She heard the barricades fall. She heard the change in the sound above, the way the gunfire shifted from controlled to desperate. She heard the skittering of chitin on stone, and she knew that the swarm was inside the zone. TL was pressed against her side. The others were huddled together, their glow almost completely gone, their small bodies shaking with fear. Orethi had never held a weapon in her life. No Velinari had. Their species had believed for 12,000 years that violence was something they were above, something primitive that they had evolved beyond. She had taught this to her students. She had believed it with her whole being. She did not believe it anymore. She picked up a piece of structural steel from the rubble. It was heavy in her forearms. She stood up and walked to the door of the basement and placed herself between the darkness above and the children below. She was shaking so badly that her bioluminescence was strobing, flickering on and off like a broken light. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But she did not move. And around her, other Velinari did the same. A metallurgist picked up a length of pipe. A doctor grabbed a piece of broken stone. An elderly poet, who had not stood unaided in years, braced herself against the wall and held a shard of crystal like a blade. One by one, the Velinari civilians in that shelter found whatever they could hold and formed a line. It was not a military line. It was not organized or strategic. It was a group of teachers and artists and scientists and poets standing in front of children with scraps of metal in their hands, facing a predatory swarm that had consumed 3 continents. They held for 6 minutes. 6 minutes of chaos and terror and desperate courage. Of Velinari who had never known violence, swinging pieces of debris at creatures that did not understand mercy. 2 of them fell. 3 more were wounded. But they held the doorway, and not a single Drakith reached the children. Then the wall exploded inward. Breaching charges blew a hole through the side of the building, and through the dust and smoke came Danny Harlow and his squad. They came in loud and fast, the way Marines always came, and the sound of their weapons filled the basement like a physical force. Harlow moved through the room like a machine, dropping Drakith with precise, controlled bursts, while his squad fanned out and sealed every entry point. He reached Orithy and pulled her behind cover with one arm while firing with the other. She was bleeding from a cut on her face where a Drakith claw had grazed her, and she was still holding the piece of steel. "You are insane," Harlow said, breathing hard. He was not sure she understood the words, but he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. Then she touched his arm with one of her free hands, a gesture that meant something deep and grateful in her language, and turned back to the children. Tyel was crying, but alive. They were all alive. Harlow keyed his comm. Sector 4 breach is contained. Civilians are secure. But Colonel, if the swarm keeps doing this, concentrated strikes like this, we cannot hold all sectors simultaneously. We need a permanent solution. Up on the Coronado, Dunn already knew. The ground war was buying time, but it was not winning the fight. As long as the fold space tears remained open, the swarm would keep coming. They had traced the source of the tears to a massive Draketh hive node buried beneath the ocean floor, 60 kilometers off the northern coast. The node was generating the fold space connections and broadcasting the hive mind signal that coordinated the swarm. If it was destroyed, the tiers would close, and the swarm on the surface would lose its coordination and fragment. "We could hit it with a kinetic strike from orbit," Soto said. "One clean shot." "No," Dunn replied. "I ran the simulations. A kinetic strike at that depth would trigger tsunamis along the entire northern coastline. There are still 200,000 Velinari in the coastal zones. We would kill the people we came here to save." "Then how?" Dunn pulled up a schematic of the hive node on the display. It was an organic structure, roughly spherical, about 300 meters across, sitting on the ocean floor beneath 2 kilometers of water. Around it, the scans showed dense concentrations of aquatic phase Draketh, larger and more heavily armored than their surface counterparts. "Submersible insertion," Dunn said. "A demolition team goes down, plants charges directly on the node's structural weak points, and gets out before detonation." Soto looked at him for a long moment. "Sir, the aquatic Draketh are everywhere down there. The odds of extraction after placing the charges are very low." "I know. You are asking people to volunteer for a mission they probably will not come back from." "I am." The volunteer list was posted for exactly 12 minutes before Dunn had to close it. Every Marine in the unit had signed up. He selected a team of 12, chosen for their demolition expertise and their ability to stay calm in conditions that would break most people. The team leader was Lieutenant Greg Faulkner. He was a quiet man from a small coastal town on Earth who rarely spoke more than necessary and had a habit of accomplishing impossible things and then writing reports about them that made them sound routine. He assembled his team in the submersible bay and briefed them with the same tone he might use to describe a walk to the grocery store. "We go down. We plant 4 charges at the structural weak points. We set timers for 15 minutes, and we leave. Simple." Corporal Reyes, who had volunteered despite having a piece of Draketh chitin still embedded in her left shoulder from the previous day, raised an eyebrow. "Simple," she repeated. "Simple," Faulkner confirmed. Ambassador Cathari watched the submersible launch from a monitor in the command post. The small craft descended into the dark water and disappeared. She stood beside Captain Vega, her 4 hands clasped tightly together. "They know they might not come back," Cathari said. It was not a question. "They know," Vega said. "And they went anyway. They went anyway." Cathari felt something shift inside her. She had spent her life studying other species, trying to understand the different shapes that intelligence and culture could take. She had thought she understood humans. She had read the reports. Emotionally volatile, irrational, aggressive. She understood now that every single one of those assessments had been wrong. Humans were not irrational. They simply operated on a logic that other species had not encountered before. A logic that said the value of a life was not measured by what that life could give you in return. The 12 Marines in that submersible were not diving into darkness because of orders or duty or some abstract principle. They were doing it because there were 600 million people above them who would die if they did not. And they could not live in a universe where they had the power to prevent that and chose not to. Cathari watched the blinking dot on the screen descend deeper and deeper into the black water. "Come back," she whispered in Velinari. "Please, come back." The ocean at 60 kilometers offshore was black and cold, and full of things that wanted to kill them. Lieutenant Greg Faulkner sat in the pilot's seat of the submersible and watched the depth counter climb. 100 meters, 300, 700. The hull creaked softly around them, adjusting to the growing pressure. Outside the small viewports, the darkness was absolute, except for the occasional flash of bioluminescence from something large, moving just beyond the range of their lights. The 12 Marines inside the craft were silent. There was nothing to say. Each of them had written a letter before they left, sealed it, and handed it to someone they trusted. It was a tradition as old as human warfare, the act of putting your last words on paper, just in case you could not deliver them in person. Corporal Reyes sat with her eyes closed, her hand resting on the medallion around her neck. Beside her, a Marine named Sam Voss was checking the detonation timers for the 4th time, not because he doubted they worked, but because his hands needed something to do. Cody Marsh, who had volunteered despite Harlow telling him twice that he did not have to, sat in the back with his knees pulled up, humming under his breath. At 1,400 meters, the sonar began to scream. "Contact," said Faulkner. "Multiple. They are everywhere." The aquatic phase Draketh were different from their surface cousins. They were larger, some of them 3 meters long, with elongated bodies built for speed in deep water. Their chitin was thicker, darker, and their mouths were wider. They moved through the water in spiraling patterns around the hive node, a living shield of thousands of predators guarding the heart of the swarm. He angled the submersible toward a gap in the patrol pattern that the Coronado's scanners had identified and pushed the engines to full. They made it through the outer ring. Then the Draketh noticed them. The creatures came from below and from both sides, slamming into the hull with enough force to throw the Marines against their harnesses. The submersible rocked violently. Alarms began to sound. Faulkner fought the controls and kept the craft on course, while the hull groaned under repeated impacts. "Structural integrity holding," Voss reported. "Barely." Ahead of them, visible now through the forward viewport, was the hive node. It was massive, a dark sphere of organic matter sitting on the ocean floor like a tumor on the body of the world. Veins of pulsing light ran across its surface, and even through the water, the Marines could feel it, a vibration that was not quite sound, the signal that connected every Draketh on the planet to a single purpose. Faulkner brought the submersible in close and locked it against the node's outer surface. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic thud. "We have 15 minutes from the time the first charge is set," Faulkner said. "4 charges, 4 structural weak points. Teams of 3. Move fast, stay together, and do not stop for anything." "Clear?" "Clear," 11 voices answered. The hatch opened, and they went into the water. The interior of the hive node was a nightmare. The walls were organic, pulsing faintly, covered in a thick membrane that reacted to their presence by contracting and expanding. The corridors were not built for anything with a human body shape, and the Marines had to crawl and squeeze through spaces that pressed against them from all sides. The aquatic Draketh were inside too. The first firefight happened 60 meters in. The creatures came from a side passage, fast and silent, and they were on top of the first team before anyone could shout a warning. 2 Marines went down in the first 3 seconds. Sam Voss dragged one of them back, while Reyes put round after round into the creatures at point-blank range, the sound of gunfire deafening in the enclosed space. They lost 2 people in that corridor. There was no time to stop. Faulkner gave the order to keep moving, and they kept moving. The charges were planted one by one. Each team reached their assigned weak point, attached the explosive package to the organic wall, armed the timer, and fought their way back toward the submersible. It was brutal. It was desperate. Every meter cost something. 11 minutes after they had entered the node, the surviving 10 Marines were back inside the submersible. Faulkner sealed the hatch and hit the emergency ballast. The craft shot upward like a cork released from the bottom of a pool, the engines screaming, the hull cracking from the sudden change in pressure. Behind them, the Draketh gave chase, dozens of the aquatic creatures rising with them, slamming into the hull again and again. Faulkner watched the depth counter fall. 1,000 meters, 700, 400. "Timer at 60 seconds, Voss said. "Come on," Faulkner muttered, willing the craft to move faster. They broke the surface 14 seconds before the charges detonated. The explosion was unlike anything anyone on the surface had ever seen. A column of water and light rose from the ocean, climbing 3 kilometers into the sky. The shockwave rolled across the water in a ring that could be seen from orbit. Deep below, the hive node came apart, its organic structure shattering under the force of 4 simultaneous detonations. And then, across the entire planet, the Draketh stopped. It happened all at once. The swarm creatures on the surface froze in place, their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. The fold space tears in the sky above Selur began to close, one by one, collapsing like doors slamming shut in a long hallway. The signal that had connected 2 billion creatures to a single mind was gone, and without it, the swarm was nothing but billions of confused animals. On the ground, Danny Harlow watched the Draketh in front of his position stumble and scatter. They ran in circles. They bumped into walls. The wave that had been pressing against his line for 4 days simply fell apart. "Hold fire," Harlow said into his comm, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "All units, hold fire. Something's happening." It took the Marines 31 more hours to finish the job. They swept every sector, every building, every tunnel, hunting down the remaining swarm creatures in groups that grew smaller and more disorganized by the hour. It was not easy, and it was not safe. But the impossible pressure was gone, and the Marines could feel it. When the last all-clear was given, Danny Harlow sat down on the steps of the ruined concert hall in Velinor and did not get up for a very long time. His rifle was across his knees. His hands were shaking, a fine tremor that he could not stop, no matter how hard he tried. Beside him, Priya Nolan had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting against a broken pillar. Cody Marsh was sitting on the ground nearby, handing out ration packs to a group of Velinari children who had never seen food wrapped in foil, and were more interested in the shiny packaging than the contents. The cost was real. Of the 4,000 Marines who had dropped onto Selur, 312 did not survive. Their names would be carved into a memorial that the Velinari built at the center of Velinur, a spire of crystal that caught the light of the twin suns and scattered it in patterns that looked like falling stars. The Velinari had no tradition of war memorials. They had never needed one before. They built this one because the humans taught them, without meaning to, that some things are worth remembering, even when they hurt. 6 weeks later, Ambassador Cathari stood at the central podium of the Galactic Forum. The chamber was full. Every species was represented. The Torvans sat in their elevated seats. The hegemony of Rin occupied their traditional place. The Ulari were present, and so were dozens of other civilizations that had watched from a distance while Salur burned. Cathari folded her forearms in the formal posture of testimony and spoke. I came before this body and begged for help. Most of you said no. Some of you offered words. One species answered. They said 4,000 of their people to fight a swarm of billions. They asked for nothing in return, no payment, no territory, no political advantage. They came because we were dying, and they could not accept that. The chamber was silent. You have called humans dangerous. You are right. They are the most dangerous species I have ever met. They are dangerous because they will walk into fire for people they have never met, bleed for strangers they owe nothing to, and die for a principle that most of you cannot even name. She paused, letting the silence stretch. If that frightens you, I suggest you ask yourselves what it says about the rest of us. In the gallery above, Captain Nora Vega sat in her dress uniform, watching. Beside her, Colonel Dunn and Lieutenant Faulkner, whose arm was still in a regeneration cast, listened without expression. The Galactic Forum voted unanimously to grant humanity a permanent seat on the Security Council. It was the fastest unanimous vote in the Forum's history. Afterward, Cathari found Vega in the corridor outside the chamber. They looked at each other for a long moment, two beings from different worlds who had been through something that words could not fully capture. Thank you, Cathari said, for everything. Vega gave a small shrug. You needed help. We were there. Cathari reached out with all four arms and wrapped them around Vega. Vega was surprised for a moment. Then she put her arms around Cathari and held on. It was the first embrace between a human and a Velinari ever recorded. It would not be the last. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed. Not because of laws or treaties or trade agreements. It changed because a species that had been dismissed as young and reckless had crossed the stars to stand in smoke and bleed for strangers. And in doing so, they answered a question that the galaxy had been asking since its first civilizations looked up at the sky. What makes a species worthy? It is not power. It is not age. It is not the size of their empire or the strength of their ships. It is what they do when someone weaker asks for help, and there is nothing to gain by saying yes. They called it duty. On the rebuilt steps of the concert hall in Velinur, where Danny Harlow had once sat with shaking hands, a Velinari child named TL grew up. He grew tall and bright, his bioluminescence stronger than most, and when he was old enough to choose a profession, he chose to study humans. He spent his life trying to understand them. He read their history, learned their languages, visited their world, and at the end of a long career, he wrote a single sentence that was carved into the base of the Crystal Memorial in Velinur, below the names of 312 Marines who gave everything for people they had never met. The sentence read, "They came because we asked. They stayed because that is who they are." And the galaxy, slowly and with great difficulty, began to learn what that meant. The sky above the planet Salur had not been blue for 11 days. It was the color of ash now, a thick and choking gray that blocked out the twin suns and turned day into a permanent twilight. Fires burned across 3 continents. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were nothing but rubble and smoke. and moving through the ruins, like a living carpet of darkness, the Draketh swarm consumed everything in its path. Ambassador Kethari stood in the communications chamber of the last working relay station on the planet. She was tall and thin, with translucent skin that glowed faintly with soft blue light when she was calm. She was not calm now. The glow had faded to almost nothing, and her 4 slender arms were pressed tightly against her body in a posture that any Velinari would recognize as deep fear. Around her, the surviving members of the High Council sat in silence. There were only 9 of them left. There had been 40 just a week ago. Elder Sivan, the oldest of them, had not spoken in 2 days. His bioluminescence had gone completely dark, and Kethari feared that his mind had gone with it. The Velinari were not a species built for war. In their entire history, spanning over 12,000 years, they had never fought a battle. They had no weapons, no soldiers, no military strategy. They were scientists, artists, philosophers. They had believed with a certainty that now seemed foolish that intelligence and peace would always be enough. The Draketh had proven them wrong. The swarm had arrived without any warning. Massive tears in fold space had opened above Salur, and from those tears had poured billions of creatures. They were insectoid, eyeless, covered in dark chitin, and driven by a single biological need: to consume organic matter and reproduce. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They simply ate. In the first 3 days, the northern continent fell. The great universities of Peloth, where Velinari scholars had studied the nature of consciousness for 6,000 years, were reduced to empty shells. The gardens of Veth Miral, considered the most beautiful place in the known galaxy, were stripped bare. 17 million Velinari died in those first 3 days, and the swarm showed no sign of slowing. Kethari had sent distress calls to every major power in the galaxy. She had begged. She had offered anything and everything the Velinari had. The responses had broken something inside her. The Torvon Collective, the oldest and most powerful civilization in the galactic community, had responded with a formal statement expressing deep concern and recommending evacuation where possible. They offered no ships and no soldiers. The hegemony of Rin had sent a message of spiritual comfort, suggesting that the Velinari find peace in the acceptance of cosmic cycles. The Alari Syndicate had simply cut the communication channel before Kethari finished speaking. Now she stood in the relay chamber, staring at a screen that showed one final name on the contact list. A species that had only been part of the galactic community for a little under 2 centuries. A species that most of the galaxy considered young, loud, and dangerously unpredictable. Humans. Kethari had read every intelligence report available on them. The galactic assessments were not kind. Humans were described as emotionally volatile and prone to irrational aggression. Their history was a long record of wars fought among themselves, often for reasons that other species found difficult to understand. The Galactic Forum had quietly placed them on a watch list, categorizing them as a prematurity concern, which was a polite way of saying that the rest of the galaxy was not sure humans could be trusted. But the reports also contained other details that the analysts seemed to find confusing rather than significant. Humans had a documented pattern of rushing toward danger to help others. Their emergency responders ran into burning buildings. Their soldiers threw themselves on explosives to protect their companions. They had a concept called leaving no one behind that appeared to override their survival instincts in ways that defied biological logic. Kethari did not care about galactic politics anymore. She cared about the 600 million Velinari still alive on Salur, a number that dropped with every passing hour. She opened the channel. The signal traveled across light years in an instant, bouncing through a series of fold space relay nodes until it reached a human military outpost at the edge of their territorial space. There was a long pause. Then a face appeared on the screen. The woman looking back at Cathari had brown skin, close-cropped dark hair, and eyes that were steady in a way Cathari had not seen in anyone for 11 days. She wore a dark uniform, with markings that Cathari's translator identified as belonging to the United Earth Marine Corps. The name on her uniform read, Captain Nora Vega. "This is an emergency broadcast," Cathari said, and she was ashamed to hear her voice breaking. "I am Ambassador Cathari of the Velinari people. Our homeworld is under attack by a swarm species designated Draketh. We have no military capability. Our planetary shields have failed. Approximately 600 million of our people remain alive, but this number decreases rapidly. We are requesting immediate military intervention. We will agree to any terms you require, any terms at all, please." Captain Vega did not react the way the Torvan had. She did not offer condolences or spiritual guidance. She did not look away or consult a policy manual. She leaned forward, and her expression changed in a way that Cathari would later describe as something switching on behind her eyes. "Ambassador, can you give me the current positions of your surviving population centers?" Cathari transmitted the data with shaking hands. Vega studied it for less than 10 seconds. Then she looked at someone off-screen and spoke in a clipped, rapid tone. "Get me Colonel Dunn. Scramble 2nd and 5th MEUs. I want drop pods loaded and assault carriers at fold space entry points within 90 minutes. This is not a drill." Cathari heard the sound of movement in the background. Boots on metal floors. Voices rising with urgency, but not panic. The sound of a machine that had been waiting for exactly this moment, coming to life. Vega turned back to the screen. "Ambassador, I need you to keep this channel open. We are coming. Do you understand me? We are coming." Cathari could not speak for a moment. She nodded. "How long?" she finally managed. 18 hours, maybe less. Keep your people together and away from open ground as much as possible. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." Vega out. The screen did not go dark. Cathari could still hear the background noise of rapid preparation. She turned to face the council. Her bioluminescence had returned, faintly, for the first time in days. "They are coming," she said. Elder Sivan stirred. His eyes focused for the first time in 2 days. "Who?" he asked, his voice like dry paper. "The humans." Sivan blinked. "One species? Against the Draketh?" Cathari replayed the conversation in her mind. She thought about the way Vega had not asked what the Draketh were, how many there were, or what weapons they had. She had asked where the survivors were. That had been her first and only question. "They did not ask about the enemy," Cathari said quietly. "They asked about our people. They asked where our people were, and then they started moving." Sivan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Either they are fools, or they are something we do not have a word for." Cathari looked at the screen, where the sounds of a species preparing for war continued to pour through the speakers. Somewhere, across the vast emptiness of space, thousands of humans were putting on armor and loading weapons and climbing into ships. Not because they had been ordered to, not because they owed the Velinari anything, but because someone had asked for help and they had the ability to give it. "Perhaps both," Cathari whispered. "Perhaps both." Outside, the swarm continued to advance. But for the first time in 11 days, the people inside the relay station felt something other than despair. They did not have a word for it in the Velinari language. The closest translation was the feeling of seeing light after a long darkness. But even that was not quite right. The humans, they would later learn, called it hope.